Welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. Today is June 5th, 2024, and our guest today is Juergen Kaehler, a professor of economics at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg since April 1999. From 1991 to 94, he worked at the Center for European Economic Research, where he established and headed the International Financial Markets and Financial Management Research Department. After lecturing at the University of Exeter in 1995, he received his PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science with a thesis in economics. Last year, he received an honorary professorship from the Kharkiv National University of Economics. He has been a visiting professor at the University of Exeter and at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. He has taught courses in economics, finance, and econometrics at universities all over the world: Ukraine, Mexico, South Africa, Turkey, Chile, and the Netherlands. He has published widely on economics, and among his most recent articles is one entitled Economic Aspects of the War in Ukraine, written jointly with Dr. Vasyl Namoniuk, associate professor at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Professor Kaehler.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor.
In your recent paper with Dr. Namoniuk, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, you argue that the difference in economic size of nations is an important factor in determining the outcome of wars. So to what extent is that being borne out in the Russia-Ukrainian war over the past 2 years?
Yes, that has the claim that the economic size of belligerent nations is an important factor has been recognized and noticed for a long time. You know that there is analysis of World War I that shows that when the United States entered into the war and joined the Allied powers in 1917, the Allies gained a decisive advantage against the Central Powers, and that was because of larger GDP, but also GDP per capita. Now, when we look at the data, we see that indeed the GDP, gross domestic product, in Russia is much larger than that of Ukraine. Ukraine has about 21% of GDP that Russia has. And therefore, Ukraine wouldn't have the economic power to draw on when fighting a war against Russia. So it needs support from other nations, and economic support, financial support, that sort of thing. When you look at other aspects of the size of nations, GDP is what we call in economics a flow variable. Then the sum of goods and services produced in a year. When you look at a stock variable, which is the wealth, and the stock of wealth, then there's also a clear advantage of Russia over Ukraine. Ukraine has about 10% of the wealth, both in terms of capital, human capital, and natural resources. So again, it is clear that Ukraine needs support from other countries. Otherwise, it would be in a helpless situation and would have lost the war in a few weeks or months.
And what about the beginning of the war, when it seemed as though Ukraine was doing so well against Russia? I mean, what can you ascribe that difference to?
Yes, I think that came as a big surprise to many people, and especially to the Russians, who expected a quick win within weeks, really, 2 or 3 weeks. By the way, there's a parallel here, an interesting parallel to World War I, where the German side also expected a win within a few weeks, and then it ended up in a war of attrition. And we have the same type of war of attrition now. I think the reason why Ukraine didn't have to surrender was that it was clear back in 21, in November and December 21, that Russia had intentions to invade. So there was time to prepare for it, and that's why Russia was not able to win within a few weeks. So I think the Ukrainians were better prepared than the Russians assumed.
To what extent would you say that this factor benefits Russia? I mean, are they able to squeeze their population even more because they're used to a lower standard of living? I mean, if we're thinking about per capita GDP.
Yes, well, I wouldn't say that they are able to squeeze the population because of a lower standard of living. And indeed, you're right. The standard of living as measured by GDP per capita is lower in the Russian Federation than it is in the West. The GDP per capita in Russia is about $33,000, and it's almost $70,000 in the United States. In the European Union, it's just below 50,000. For me, it was quite surprising to see that GDP per capita in Ukraine is much lower than in the much lower than in Russia. It's less than half the value of Russia. Why is the GDP per capita important? Well, it reflects productivity, economic productivity, but perhaps more importantly, it reflects technological development. And that plays a role also in military conflicts, as we have seen. And therefore, it's good to have a high standard of well, not only economic activity, but technological development.
And that's in comparison. I think that Western media often presents Ukraine as having a very vibrant technological sector.
Yes, Ukraine has a very vibrant economy, especially in the IT sector. And that's why I was really surprised to see these figures of GDP per capita being half the value of Russia in Ukraine. But I think that can be explained by the fact that Russia is very resource rich in oil resources and gas resources, and especially.
You talk about in your paper how the Russian economy is large and they rely on resources, but it's also unbalanced because it's almost entirely dependent on oil and gas. So does that mean that the non-gas and oil economy is relatively small?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's certainly true. Russia is very strong in the energy sector, and that's true for oil and that's true for gas. When you look at exports, then Russia is the second largest exporter of crude oil behind Saudi Arabia, but the largest exporter of natural gas in the world. And you see similar figures for reserves that are probably more important. Russia has the 8th largest reserves of crude oil in the world, but by far the largest reserves of gas in the world. So it's very dominant there. It's the largest player on the gas market and the second largest in the oil sector. And these oil profits, the profits from extracting and selling oil represent almost 10% of GDP of Russia. So you're quite right. Russia very much depends on its energy sector.
So that the other, so its non-gas and oil sector is quite small, is that it's
Yes, compared to other countries, you know, it is relatively, the other sectors are relatively small.
the West presented its sanctions in some sense as an effective instrument that would severely limit Russia's military capabilities and be an alternative to military action. And has that argument held up in practice?
Not really. Not to the extent that everybody hoped and expected this to be the case. The sanctions were very strong, you know, compared to the sanctions that were too small and too little and too limited in 2014. Now, you know, when you look at the sanctions, what we call the sanctions coalition, that comprises about 50 countries, and more than 1,500 Russian individuals are affected by sanctions, and the US imposed sanctions on 2,500 Russian companies. You know, these are large figures. The EU even more, 3,700. And so these sanctions are unprecedented, really, when you compare this to previous sanctions on other countries. But they didn't lead to a quick end to the war. You know, if that is the benchmark, if that's the expectation that, you know, you expected Russia to be on its knees, so to speak, because of the sanctions, that hasn't happened. But certainly the sanctions have affected Russia, and they would, at least in two ways. You know, the most popular forms of sanctions are bans on exports and imports. Now, even if a country is able to import, in spite of sanctions, it would still have to import at a higher price. And the export ban would have the implication, even if you can circumvent the export ban, that your export revenue would be lower because, you know, volumes go down, but also the prices go down. You know, if Russia sells oil to India instead of Western Europe, then it sells at a discount. So the revenue will decrease.
And so what explains the limited impact of Western sanctions? What's the explanation for the limitations?
Well, first of all, it's only partial compliance to the sanctions. Then it's a redirection of trade flows, alternative suppliers that Russia seeks, and it gets these alternative suppliers from countries like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. These three countries are part of the Eurasian Economic Union. That's a customs union with Russia and Belarus. And the empirical results show that EU exports to Russia decreased by more than half, but that the exports to these three countries that I just mentioned increased by between 50% and 250%. So that's the Eurasian roundabout, so to speak, that Russia uses to avoid the sanctions. There's also trade via China and Turkey, and we know Russia would still, as I just said, would still be affected by lower revenues and higher prices that it has to pay for the imports. But quite surprisingly, you know, the empirical evidence shows that it took about 2 to 4 months for these new supply routes to emerge for Russia. So That's how Russia avoided much of the sanctions.
Have they taken any measures to protect themselves? I mean, this is, I guess, these supply routes is one measure. But are there others? Is it setting itself up so that it will be protected in the future?
Well, first of all, Russia imposed counter sanctions, didn't it? So it stopped supply of gas to Europe. But in the long run, that will backfire on Russia, because what Europe was able to achieve, to everybody's surprise, was to find new supplies in a very short period of time. You know, we had the fear here in Germany and in other countries, but especially in Germany, because no other country was so much dependent on energy imports, gas and oil imports from Russia, more than any other country in Europe. But there was fear that we would suffer quite a lot in terms of energy shortages. But it actually was, to everybody's surprise, or almost everybody's surprise, possible to find alternative supplies. LNG, liquid natural gas, was bought and shipped to Europe and to Germany. So that's that was the Western reaction to the counter sanctions. And the West also then realized that Russia weaponized oil and gas, and that was a new experience, because the West expected Russia to be a reliable supplier of energy and not to weaponize this against Europe, especially.
So to what extent did Western sanctions fail to take into account Russia's relationship with China and other countries such as India? As an economist, did you kind of see this coming?
Yes, I think also the West saw this coming, because you see that in all sorts of sanctions, and sanctions are not always successful. And in fact, political scientists and economists are quite skeptical about sanctions. And there's mixed evidence about their efficiency and their success rates. But there's a move now in the United States and Europe to reconsider sanctions and to tighten up sanctions. And we are aware of the fact that there are ways around the sanctions, but the answer to that is to apply what we call secondary sanctions. So if Russia tries to find alternative routes via other countries, you would threaten to sanction these countries. And we've seen this with the case of Iran and other cases as well, that it's actually often sufficient to threaten secondary sanctions, and implementation is often not necessary. I give you 2 examples. Russian, or rather Turkish banks used to accept Russian payment card Mir, but these Turkish banks were convinced, so to speak, to stop that. And another example is India, and India violated the price cap on oil. There's a price cap of $60 per barrel on oil, and Indian refineries reportedly violated this price cap. But after discussions with the US Treasury, they stopped that.
Now, in your moving on in your paper, you note that wars can stimulate economic activity. So to what extent has Russia been able to compensate for its sanctions by putting the economy on a war footing, such as the production of military equipment and so forth?
Yes, in some cases, a war can actually stimulate economic activity. Well, there's an increase in government spending. There's an increase in jobs and investing in defense-related industries. And wars can also stimulate technological advancements and innovation. So these are the positive effects of the war on the country that is at war, or potentially positive effects. But I think we are all surprised how well the Russian economy does. And in the first quarter of this year, the Russian economy grew by about 5%, which is much more than the growth rates that we have in the EU. The stock market, as measured by the stock price index MOEX, is also robust. The exchange rate is at around 90 ruble per dollar, and it has appreciated a bit over the more recent time. It depreciated very strongly just after the war broke out in February 22 to 120 rubles per dollar, but now it is at around 90 rubles per dollar. A sign of stress on the Russian economy is can be seen when you look at inflation. Inflation stands at around 8% at the moment. Now, the Russian central bank has a inflation target of 4%, so inflation is higher than targeted, and that is because there's increases in wages. Actually, there's no unemployment in Russia. In fact, if anything, there's labor shortages because a lot of Russians left the country, fled the country, hundreds of thousands, and there's also the war and the personnel that needs to go, soldiers that need to go in the army. But there are signs of stress on the Russian economy. One is that apparently the Russian Treasury plans to increase the corporate income tax from 20% to 25%. And the other point is, Gazprom is the largest company in Russia. And last year, for the first time in its history, it produced a loss. But it was a huge loss of about $7 billion, if converted in US dollars. So the energy sector is under stress, and the plan to divert gas supplies from Western Europe to China turned out to be much more complicated than anticipated from the Russian side.
Can you trust the statistics that you're getting from Russia on the economy?
That's a very good question. Some publications of statistics were actually abandoned. They don't publish. The Russians don't publish some of their data on the budget, and I'm very cautious about data on international trade. If they're published, then they might be biased. So I look at indicators that are difficult to manipulate, like the exchange rate. That's a price that you see on international markets, and also the stock price, the MOEX, is certainly not manipulated, and they don't show any signs of an ailing Russian economy, and that's because of the large revenues from oil and gas.
Now, economists love the notion of rational actors. And do you think Putin has shown himself to be a rational actor in terms of the Russian economy since February 2022? Were there any economic motivations for Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, indeed. Rationality is a key concept in economics. You could say this is the axiom of economics. That separates economics from other social sciences. We do assume that actors have or act rationally. And of course, we notice that not all actions are rational, but economists want to analyze rational actions because they're easier to analyze than non-rational actions. So yes, indeed, there's rationality in what Putin did from an economic point of view. However, I have to say that I think that from my point of view as an economist, I don't see the economic aspects as being key or central to Putin's plans. His plans are more geopolitical, and he wants to restore Russia as as a dominant or one of the dominant powers. Wants to restore the Soviet Union and sees the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union as the biggest disaster of recent decades. So he wants to reverse history, but taking control of Ukraine that he believes is part of Russia. You know, he has this notion of the Russian world. And he denies that Ukraine is an independent nation and has a national identity. But to have control over Ukraine comes in handy, I would say, you know, because Ukraine has always been the breadbasket of Europe and of Russia as well. And if you look at the market shares, the combined market shares of Russia and Ukraine in agriculture, you see the rationale to join forces, you know, to join forces forcefully here through occupying this country. But Russia and Ukraine combined are the dominant suppliers of agricultural goods like maize and especially sunflower. The combined market share of these two countries is more than 50% in sunflower. It's also more than 20%. That's the world market. You know, it's not the European, but the world market. The combined share of these two countries in wheat is also more than 20%, and that's very, very large. You know, the East Ukraine is also attractive because of its the Donbas region is the region of iron production and you know, heavy industries.
You mentioned Donbas and the regions in Ukraine, and I'm thinking now about the part of your paper in which you describe how post-war recoveries can be quick. But at the same time, you emphasize the destruction that's caused Ukraine, that's been caused in Ukraine, and the difficulty for the recovery there, giving a very vivid picture of the dire economic consequences of the war on that country. To cite one example, you say that Ukraine's housing stock has seen a loss of over 167,000 residential buildings, and just the explosion at the Kharkiv Dam caused a loss of 37,000 residential buildings. So given all of this devastation, what do you think is the most likely post-war scenario in terms of economic recovery?
Well, first of all, it depends to a very large degree of what the outcome of the war will be. You know, and whether it's a defeat of Russia or whether it's a defeat of Ukraine, or whether Ukraine will lose some territory. But overall, I'm very optimistic when it comes to the post-war economic development of Ukraine. You know, Germany after the Second World War experienced in the 1950s and 1960s what we call the economic miracle, and that was certainly because, to very large extent, because of the Marshall Plan for Europe. So first of all, we need a modern Marshall Plan for Ukraine, where the old Marshall Plan is not the template, but an inspiration. There are some very fundamental questions to answer. One is, probably the most important one is, should the aid be in forms of grants or loans? And if we take the experience from the Marshall Plan, it should be largely grants. Large sums have to be put on the table, so to speak. And, you know, I think that Russia would have to contribute very heavily to these funds. But the infrastructure that, as you just described, was so largely destroyed, needs to be rebuilt. There needs to be technical assistance. So it's a huge effort. And the longer the war drags on, the higher the cost will be. So in a way, it would be good to see that the war is over soon. But if you ask me, I think it's more important that Ukraine wins the war. You know, and wins it in the sense of its current targets, you know, getting Crimea back and getting Donbas back.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we're going to have to end our interview. I just want to thank you so much, Professor Kaehler, for sharing your research and economic analysis of the war and impacts on both Ukraine and Russia. And we wish you the very best and hope to see you again on Rights in Russia.
Right. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. And as the Ukrainians say, Slava Ukraini.